There are families that seem to live in the sun, golden, glamorous, and blessed with an almost mythical combination of wealth, power, and beauty. For a time, the Kennedy family was that family. They were America's royals, the architects of Camelot, a dynasty that seemed destined to shape the 20th century. And at the very heart of that dazzling galaxy, there was always one constant, steady presence: the matriarch, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. We know the image: the impeccably dressed mother, always poised, always smiling, standing proudly beside her handsome, world-conquering sons. She was the quiet force, the moral compass, the keeper of the flame. But behind that carefully constructed public facade lies a story of almost unimaginable darkness, a story of loss so profound and so relentless it would have shattered any ordinary person. This is not a story about politics or power. It's a story about a woman who gave birth to 9 children, raised them to believe they could change the world, and then had to watch as that world in its cruelty took them from her one by one. It is a story that forces us to ask one of the most difficult questions there is. How much can a human heart endure before it breaks? And what happens when it doesn't? This is the story of Rose Kennedy and the tragic hidden truths behind the woman who survived it all. To understand the iron will of Rose Kennedy, you have to understand the world that forged her. She was born Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald in 1890 into the heart of Irish Catholic Boston. This was a city sharply divided. On one side, you had the Boston Brahmins, the established wealthy Protestant elite who traced their ancestry back to the Mayflower and controlled the city's commerce and culture. On the other, you had the burgeoning Irish immigrant community, looked down upon, discriminated against, and stereotyped as poor, uneducated, and politically corrupt. It was a world of no Irish need apply signs, of social exclusion and quiet contempt. This environment created a powerful us against them mentality among the Boston Irish. It fueled a ferocious ambition to succeed, to beat the Brahmins at their own game, not just with money, but with political power. And no one embodied this ambition more than Rose's own father, the legendary John Honeyfitz Fitzgerald. Honeyfitz was a political force of nature, charming, charismatic, and a master of machine politics. He rose from humble beginnings to become a congressman, and most famously, the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. Rose was his eldest and favorite child. She was born into the crucible of politics. The dinner table was a classroom where she learned about precinct votes and political strategy. She grew up in a world of rallies, parades, and public appearances, always at her father's side. He adored her, showed her off, and saw in her the refinement and grace that could elevate the family name. She was given the best education a Catholic girl could receive, including a finishing school education in a Dutch convent, where she became fluent in French and German. But for all his adoration, Honey Fitz was a product of his time. When Rose, a brilliant student, wanted to attend the prestigious Wellesley College, her father refused. A woman's place, he believed, was not in a secular Protestant-run university. It was in the home, preparing for a suitable marriage. This denial was one of the great disappointments of Rose's young life, a moment that instilled in her a fierce determination that her own daughters would have the educational opportunities she was denied. It was also perhaps her first great lesson in suppressing her own desires for the sake of family duty, a lesson she would practice for the rest of her long life. While Rose was the polished daughter of the city's most beloved politician, a new force was rising in the Boston Irish community. He was Joseph P. Kennedy, the son of a successful saloon keeper and ward boss. Joe was everything Honey Fitz was not. He was cool, calculating, and ruthless. with an ambition for money and power that dwarfed even his future father-in-law's. He wasn't interested in the backslapping world of city politics. He had his eyes on Wall Street, on Hollywood, on the world. Joe and Rose met as teenagers, and their courtship was a 7-year epic, largely because Honey Fitz could not stand Joe Kennedy. He saw him as a rival, a cold-hearted upstart, and he did everything he could to keep him away from his precious daughter. But Rose was quietly, stubbornly in love. In Joe, she saw a strength and a vision that matched her own ambition. Theirs was a union of equals in many ways, the daughter of Boston's greatest political dynasty and the son of its greatest financial one. It was a merger that would create a force more powerful than either family could have achieved alone. Finally, in 1914, Honey Fitz relented and Rose and Joe were married. Their partnership would become one of the most formidable in American history. Joe was the engine, the strategist, the one who would go out into the world and amass a staggering fortune through banking, stock market speculation, and later, the movie business. Rose was the CEO of the domestic sphere. She was the one who would create the stable, disciplined, and fiercely competitive environment that would produce the children who were destined to fulfill their father's ultimate ambition, the presidency of the United States. They began having children almost immediately, 9 in total, born in a rapid succession that filled their home in Brookline, Massachusetts, with a whirlwind of energy. Rose approached motherhood with the same meticulous organization she applied to everything. She famously kept an index card system for each child, tracking their medical histories, their shoe sizes, their vaccinations, and their dental appointments. She drilled them in history and geography at the dinner table, instilling in them a sense of intellectual curiosity and a fierce competitive spirit. Winning was everything in the Kennedy household. As Joe famously told his sons, "We don't want any losers in this family." But behind this image of domestic order and maternal devotion, the first cracks in Rose's perfect world were already beginning to appear. Joe's business interests often took him away from home for long periods, and his infidelities were rampant and barely concealed. He had a string of affairs, most famously with the silent film star Gloria Swanson. Rose knew about them. How could she not? But she made a choice. She would not divorce him. In the world of devout Catholicism she inhabited, divorce was not an option. And more than that, she had entered into a pact. Their marriage was a dynasty in the making, and she would not be the one to break it. Her response was not to confront, but to compartmentalize. She would retreat into her faith, her children, and a kind of willed blindness, a stoic refusal to acknowledge the painful realities of her marriage. It was a coping mechanism she would be forced to rely on, again and again, as her life unfolded. In the 1930s, the Kennedy clan was on the move. Joe's fortune had grown immense, and he moved the family to New York, and then, in 1938, to London, where he was appointed the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This was the pinnacle of their social ambition. Rose presided over the American embassy as a flawless hostess, presenting her beautiful daughters to the king and queen. The Kennedys had arrived on the world stage, but it was during this period of public triumph that a heartbreaking private tragedy was unfolding, one that would haunt the family for generations. It centered on their third child and eldest daughter, Rosemary. From a young age, it was clear that Rosemary was different. She was beautiful and sweet-natured, but she struggled to keep up with her fiercely competitive siblings. Today, she would likely be diagnosed with a mild intellectual disability, something that could be managed with specialized education and support. But in the 1920s and 30s, Such conditions were poorly understood and deeply stigmatized. For a family as obsessed with perfection and public image as the Kennedys, Rosemary's struggles were a source of deep anxiety and shame. They did their best to include her, but as she grew into a young woman, her developmental delays became more pronounced, and she began to suffer from violent mood swings and seizures. Joe Kennedy, in particular, was terrified that a scandal involving Rosemary could derail the political ambitions he had for his sons. He began to search for a cure, a quick fix, and in the medical landscape of the early 1940s, a terrifying new procedure was being hailed as a miracle cure for a range of mental and behavioral issues, the prefrontal lobotomy. In 1941, when Rosemary was 23 years old, Joe Kennedy made a fateful, unilateral decision. Without, it is believed, the full knowledge or consent of his wife, he authorized doctors to perform a lobotomy on his daughter. The procedure was a brutal, imprecise act of surgical barbarism. It involved drilling holes into the patient's skull and severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex. In Rosemary's case, it was an unmitigated disaster. The once vibrant, if troubled, young woman was left with the mental capacity of a toddler. She was unable to walk or speak coherently and would require full-time care for the rest of her life. Rosemary was quietly sent away to an institution in Wisconsin, and her existence was effectively erased from the family narrative. For decades, the official story was that she was a reclusive teacher. The truth of what happened to her remained a closely guarded secret, a dark, terrible wound at the heart of the family. For Rose, the loss of her daughter in this way must have been a grief unlike any other, a living death, shrouded in silence and shame. It was the first of the great Kennedy tragedies, and in many ways the most chilling, because it was a tragedy of their own making. The tragedy of Rosemary was a secret sorrow, but soon the losses would become public, sudden, and violent. When the United States entered World War II, the Kennedy sons, despite their father's isolationist political stance, rushed to enlist. The eldest, Joe Jr., was the golden boy, the charismatic heir apparent on whom all of his father's political hopes rested. He was the one destined to be the first Kennedy president. A handsome, confident Navy pilot, he flew dangerous missions over Europe. In August of 1944, he volunteered for a top-secret and exceptionally hazardous bombing mission. The plane, packed with explosives, detonated prematurely over the English Channel. Joe Jr. was killed instantly. He was 29 years old. The blow to the family was catastrophic. Joe Sr. was said to have been utterly broken by the loss of his heir. For Rose, it was the first time she was forced to put on the public mask of the stoic, grieving mother, a role she would tragically have to reprise again and again. She relied on her deep Catholic faith, praying endlessly for the soul of her lost son. The dream was shattered, but the dynasty had to go on. The mantle of ambition now fell to the second son, a slighter, more ironic, and less confident young man named John F. Kennedy. But the blows just kept coming. Just 4 years later, in 1948, tragedy struck again. This time, it was their rebellious, vivacious daughter, Kathleen, known to the family as Kick. Kick was the most independent of the Kennedy girls. During the war, she had fallen deeply in love with a British aristocrat, Billy Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington. The problem was that Billy was a Protestant. For a devout Catholic like Rose, the idea of her daughter marrying outside the faith was anathema. She fought the union fiercely, but Kick, inheriting her family's stubborn streak, defied her mother and married the man she loved. The marriage caused a deep rift between mother and daughter. Tragically, just 4 months after their wedding, Billy was killed in action in Belgium. Kick was a widow at 24. A few years later, she found love again, this time with another wealthy married Protestant, Earl Fitzwilliam. In May of 1948, while flying with him to the south of France, their small private plane crashed in a storm. Kik was killed instantly. She was 28. Because of her relationship with a married man, the family, and particularly Rose, treated her death with a kind of quiet shame. Of all the Kennedys, only her father, Joe Sr., attended her funeral in England. Rose, who had not forgiven her daughter for defying her, chose to remain in Paris. It was a decision that would reportedly cause her immense regret in her later years. In the span of 4 years, she had lost a son in war and a daughter in a plane crash. The dream of her perfect family was turning into a waking nightmare. Out of the ashes of these early tragedies, the Kennedy dynasty was reborn. With Joe Jr. gone, all the family's resources and strategic genius were now focused on the second son, Jack. John F. Kennedy, a war hero in his own right, was elected to Congress in 1946, then to the Senate in 1952. Rose, putting aside her grief, became a tireless campaigner for her son. She hosted teas, gave speeches, and used her considerable social grace and political acumen to win over voters. She was a formidable asset, the elegant, dignified matriarch who embodied the family's values. In 1960, the ultimate prize was won. John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States. It was the culmination of everything Joe and Rose had worked for their entire lives. An Irish Catholic, the grandson of immigrants, was now the leader of the free world. The Kennedys had not just beaten the Boston Brahmins, they had conquered the world. The White House became Camelot, a brief shining moment of youth, glamour, and intellectual energy. Rose was the proudest mother in America, visiting her son in the Oval Office, a frequent guest at state dinners. The sacrifices, the discipline, the tragedies, it had all, it seemed, been worth it. But Camelot was destined to be tragically short-lived. November 22, 1963. Rose was at home in Hyannisport when the phone rang. It was her son, Ted. He told her there had been an accident in Dallas. The president had been shot. At first, she refused to believe the news was as bad as it sounded, retreating into a kind of determined optimism. But soon, the final terrible confirmation came. The president was dead. The world mourned the loss of a charismatic leader. Rose Kennedy mourned the loss of her son. Once again, she was called upon to be the stoic center of a grieving family and a grieving nation. At the funeral, the world watched as she walked with a quiet, almost unnerving composure. There were no public tears. There was only a mask of dignified sorrow. Privately, she dealt with her grief in her own way, through prayer, long solitary walks on the beach, and a resolute refusal to let the world see her break. She famously said, "I will not be vanquished by tragedy. I will continue to live my life to the fullest." But the light had gone out of her life. After Jack's death, the family's hopes, and the hopes of a nation, turned to the next brother in line, Robert F. Kennedy. Bobby, more intense, more brooding, and more openly compassionate than his older brother, seemed poised to carry the fallen banner of Camelot. He was elected senator from New York, and in 1968, he announced he was running for president. For a country torn apart by the Vietnam War and civil rights struggles, Bobby's campaign was a beacon of hope, a chance to reclaim the promise that had been lost in Dallas. Rose, now in her late 70s, once again threw herself into the fray, campaigning for another son who was reaching for the presidency. But she was also filled with a deep sense of foreboding. She was terrified of history repeating itself, so much so that she couldn't bring herself to appear with Bobby at his public rallies. Her fears were tragically, prophetically justified. On June 5, 1968, Bobby had just won the crucial California Democratic primary. He was giving a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. As he walked through the hotel's kitchen pantry, an assassin stepped forward and shot him. He died the next day. He was 42 years old. For Rose Kennedy, this loss was, in many ways, the cruelest of all. It was not just the death of another beloved son. It was the death of hope itself. It was the repetition of a nightmare she had already lived through. To lose one son to an assassin's bullet is a national tragedy. To lose a second is a grief of almost mythological, Greek tragic proportions. When she was told the news, her first reported words were a simple, heartbreaking question. Has somebody done something to one of my children? This time, the stoic composure finally cracked. A friend who visited her found her weeping uncontrollably, something no one had ever seen her do in public. The Iron Matriarch had finally been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The rest of Rose Kennedy's life was a long twilight, lived out as the guardian of a tragic legacy. There would be more sorrows. In 1969, her last surviving son, Senator Ted Kennedy, drove his car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, resulting in the death of a young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne, and ending any realistic hope of another Kennedy presidency. That same year, her husband, Joe Sr., who had been incapacitated by a severe stroke since 1961, finally died. Rose was now a widow, a woman who had outlived her husband and 4 of her 9 children. In her final decades, she became a figure of almost saintly endurance in the public imagination. She wrote her memoirs, Times to Remember, a book that presented the carefully curated official version of her life, with much of the pain and controversy smoothed over. She devoted herself to her grandchildren, her church, and her memories, but the private reality of her life was a subject of ongoing debate. Was she truly the saintly, stoic figure of her public image? Or was there a darker, more complex truth? Critics and biographers have questioned the nature of her famous stoicism. Was it a sign of incredible inner strength and grace? Or was it a form of emotional detachment, a coldness that she had cultivated as a defense mechanism? Some have suggested that her inability to show emotion, her refusal to cry in public, created a difficult emotional environment for her children, who were expected to suppress their own grief in the same way. And then there is the inescapable controversy of her marriage. Did she willingly turn a blind eye to her husband's notorious infidelities and his sometimes ruthless business and political dealings, all for the prize of creating a dynasty? Was she a silent, complicit partner in his ambition? Or was she simply a devout Catholic woman of her time, trapped in a difficult marriage with no respectable way out? The truth is likely somewhere in the complex middle. Theirs was a partnership, a pact forged in ambition and sealed by a shared, fierce desire to see their name triumph over the world that had once looked down on them. And of course, there is the dark shadow of Rosemary. While most accounts agree that Joe Kennedy made the decision for the lobotomy on his own, Rose's lifelong silence on the matter is haunting. Did she truly not know the nature of the procedure? Or was she on some level a party to the family's tragic secret? It is a question that can likely never be answered, but it adds a layer of profound moral complexity to her story. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy died in 1995 at the extraordinary age of 104. She had lived through the entire sweep of the 20th century, a century that her family had done so much to shape, and that had in turn inflicted so much pain upon them. Her historical significance is undeniable. She was the matriarch of America's most famous and consequential political dynasty. She redefined the role of the political wife and mother, turning it into a position of quiet power and influence. But her ultimate legacy is not political, it is human. Her life stands as one of the most powerful and heartbreaking case studies in resilience ever recorded. She absorbed a level of tragedy that seems almost biblical in its scope, yet she never publicly faltered. She became a symbol of grace under unimaginable pressure, a testament to the power of faith and an iron will to carry on. Whether you view her stoicism as a source of inspiring strength or as a tragic form of emotional suppression, her ability to endure is, in itself, a staggering human achievement. Her story is not a simple tale of triumph, nor is it a simple tale of tragedy. It is a complex, deeply human story about the dizzying heights of ambition and the devastating price that is sometimes paid to achieve it. It's a story about the choices we make, the secrets we keep, and the masks we wear to survive. Rose Kennedy wanted her family to be legendary, and they are. But the legend is one written not just in the ink of victory and glamour, but in the indelible blood of loss, a story of so much life and so much death. And at its center is the unforgettable woman who, against all odds, simply endured. We're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.